In this lesson, I want to introduce you to another method on the top level jest object, and it is called mock. What the mock method allows us to do is to replace all of a given object's properties with just mock functions, the exact same mock functions that we practiced creating in the last two lessons. And this is the functionality that's going to allow us to automatically replace the methods on a library like Axios with our own jest mock functions. So let me show you this example step by step. What I'm going to do here is remove all of our former code. So we have an empty test function. Then at the very top of the file, I'm going to import our Axios object from the Axios library. This is the exact same code that we have in our app component. So what I can do here is console log that Axios object for us to see. So here in our console, we see all of the available functions, or in other words, methods that are available on this object. This is code that once again does not belong to us. This is all the methods that the Axios team includes on this object that is the default export of the Axios library. So for example, right here we can see get, and that is the get method that we are using in our app component to make a get request to our mock backend. And we have a whole bunch of methods here like head and options and post for the various types of requests that you can make. So this is still our original Axios object. What we're going to do when we call the jest mock method is we're going to ask jest to loop through all of these methods and replace each one with a jest mock function. So the beautiful part about that approach is it's not manual, it's automated. Jest will simply look at everything that's available on this Axios object and replace everything with a jest mock function. We don't even need to know all of these names. We just know that jest will automatically replace all of them for us. So here's what the syntax looks like. Right here, before my describe, I'm going to take my jest global object, and on that object, we have a method called mock. And to mock, I'm going to provide the name of the NPM library that I have available in my project that I want to mock. So right here, I'm going to provide a string of Axios. So this is the exact same reference as I have right here. It is the NPM library that jest is going to loop over and mock. So now when I save this, we're once again going to console log Axios. But notice that what we see here is radically different. And that is because, once again, jest has replaced everything with a mock function. So as I scroll down, for example, here's delete, here is get. Here is the former get method that was the real get method implementation from the Axios library, the exact same method that our app component uses in its code in, for example, component did mount. But now within our test, the get method has been replaced with a jest mock function. So this is the exact same thing as the jest.fn syntax that we explored in the previous lesson, but it has been automated for us. So now if I reference, for example, axios.get, right here, I'm going to get my jest mock function, and you'll notice it has the exact same methods that we talked about earlier, such as mock return value, such as mock resolve value, etc. All of those functionalities are now available, and we can treat this as any other regular jest mock function. So now the beautiful part about this approach is now we can intercept Axios get within our test. Whenever we create or instantiate our app component, we have now replaced Axios and its get method with a mock function. So we can get that Axios get mock function to behave the exact same way as it works in our component. But now we don't need a backend. We don't need a mock server running. We can have everything confined within our test. We can simply say when we invoke the get mock function, you can resolve that, or in other words, return a promise that resolves to be an array of employee objects, right? And that way we can simulate the exact functionality that Axios does without having to worry about the burden of setting up a backend. That's a lot of additional complexity for a test, especially a unit test. Remember, the goal of a unit test is to check one thing in isolation. In this case, our one thing is our component. So adding the additional variables of a backend, right, makes the unit test not so much of a unit test, right? It turns into more of an integration test. which isn't really a bad thing necessarily, but it's not the purpose, right? A unit test, which is the smallest kind of test and the one that you should have the most frequency of in a code base, a unit test is supposed to be small, lightweight, and independent. So ideally, we want to be able to test the component by itself without having to worry about the world around it, such as the backend that it relies on. But in this case, it's obviously very hard because our component needs to make a request with Axios Get to get the data. But now we can simulate or emulate that exact same functionality by intercepting this get method call, replacing it with a jest.mock function, having the jest.mock function return what we need, an array, and then the rest of the component is totally testable. Right? We can completely test all of the functionality right here, including the render method, because we've swapped our backend with an intercepted mock function that can play the role of a backend. That's what it is. It's a stand-in, it's a substitute, it's a replacement, it's a mock. It's not the real thing, but it's something that is good enough to play the role of a backend. Or in this case, more specifically, good enough to play a role of an Axios get method, right? And now we've also further decoupled ourselves from the specific implementation of the get method from Axios, which is not our problem. That's other people's code. That's another code base. So now what we can say is we don't care how Axios get works internally. We just need it to be a promise that resolves to return an array of employee objects, right? And that code is going to look very simple right here, just like we did in our previous lessons. Knowing that Axios.get is a jest.mock function, we can call a method on it like mock resolved value, because remember, Axios.get returns a promise, right? It's not a synchronous operation, it's an asynchronous method, so it will return a promise that at some point will resolve to give you some bit of data. And right here, we can simulate that same operation. And remember, what Axios is going to give us is not actually the employee data up front. It's actually going to give us an object that contains a whole bunch of additional data. And on that object, the only property we care about is data right here. As a reminder, here is where we are accessing response.data right here. And so right here, I can make data equal to something like an empty array. And now we are simulating the exact same thing as our component needs. In this case, of course, we are simulating the idea that our get method returns an empty array with no employees. So obviously, we will need to add those employee objects in just a moment in the next lesson. But now, once again, we have replaced the real Axios get method with a mock function that is pretending to return a promise that resolves to be an object with a data property set to an empty array. This is the exact same situation as we have in the real world with the real Axios get method and its implementation. But now, because we've replaced it, we don't have to worry about the complexity of an API for our test, right? When testing in the browser, obviously a really cool idea to have JSON server running so we can see how we receive data, we can see the network request, right? But for the purposes of a unit test, it's a little bit too burdensome to set up all of that infrastructure when all we really need is just Axios.get or its replacement to return the correct data that we need in order for the component to render and for us to test the core user functionality, which is just typing, all right? So that is an introduction to the jest.mock method. You pass in a string with the npm library that you want to mock out. You can also actually mock out files from your own project, but we don't need to worry about that right now. And you're not limited, of course, to just one library. You can mock out whatever you want. Axios, another thing. But for each one, Jest will apply the same logic. It's going to take the real object, it's going to iterate over its methods, and for each of those real methods, it's going to swap it or replace it with a jest.mock function, and we can customize that mock function however we want. We can get it to return whatever value we want. We can get it to return a promise with whatever value we want. We can even provide a custom implementation, although once again, that's not really needed right now. But we can get it to behave in whatever way we need it to in order so that it fulfills the original contract, the original implementation and its purpose. We can mimic that with our mock function, and that makes it a lot easier to test our app component in isolation. So with all of this background knowledge, in the next lesson, we can finally wire up our test for the app component. So I will see you there.